I'm Hillary Hayden. I'm the organizing director at the Trade Justice Education Fund. We are a national organization working to stop the damage of corporate-centered trade deals and promote a positive vision for international trade. These Trade Justice Power Hour calls happen every third Thursday at 3 p.m. Eastern and cover a wide range of topics that are interesting and relevant for activists across the country. I do want to note that these spaces are not intended as press briefings. So if you're a member of the press, I would be happy to talk with you separately, but this is not the place for questions. With that, we'll jump in. As all of us in this space know, Donald Trump just got elected to office again, in large part by capitalizing on the public's frustrations with globalization. Much like 8 years ago, he's promised that he's going to dismantle harmful trade policies, he's going to create good paying jobs, and he's going to make America great again. Donald Trump's first presidency did see a lot of action on trade, but not necessarily in the ways that we were promised. Today, we're going to focus in on what to expect during Trump's second term on trade. What is the president-elect going to do on tariffs? What is he going to do about the U.S. Mexico-Canada Agreement? What will he do on digital trade, on trade and climate, on other areas? And most importantly, what are we going to do as trade activists to get the best possible outcomes for working people on the planet over the coming months and years? To help answer those questions, we're joined today by two of the country's leading fair trade advocates, my colleague here at the Trade Justice Education Fund, Arthur Stamoulis, our executive director, and Lori Wallach, the founder of the Rethink Trade Division at the American Economic Liberties Project. I'm going to call on Arthur to speak first about the big picture differences between Donald Trump's nationalist approach to trade policy versus the types of people and planet-focused trade policies that we advocate for. And then I'm going to hand things over to our keynote speaker, Lori, who's going to do a deeper dive on Trump's tariff proposals. And as always, we're going to have time for people's questions at the end. So with the Zoom system, you don't need to wait until the end to ask your questions. Please go ahead and type that into the Q&A feature at any time. With that, Arthur, please go ahead.
Yeah, thanks, Hillary. And hello, everybody. Appreciate the opportunity to speak with you today. So when we're trying to predict what Donald Trump is going to do in his second term, it's worth looking back at his first term. The first time Donald Trump ran for the White House, he talked a really good game about how he was going to do away with awful trade policies and bring back American jobs. And when he got into office, what did he actually do? He signed legislation giving massive tax cuts to companies that move jobs overseas. He signed a phase one trade deal with China that ignored labor rights abuses, ignored human rights abuses, was instead full of provisions granting new protections for companies that move jobs to China. He promised to remove the United States from NAFTA on his first day in office. Instead, he spent years renegotiating NAFTA, the main effect of which was a rebranding. He renamed it the U.S. Mexico-Canada Agreement, or USMCA. Now, there were some real improvements in some areas under the NAFTA renegotiation, especially the new labor rights enforcement mechanism. But that was a provision that congressional Democrats, labor unions, others on the left forced into the agreement. They weren't in Trump's original USMCA proposal, and in fact, Trump never even used those new labor rights tools to address abuses when he was in office. Only the Biden administration did. The biggest substantive changes that the Trump administration itself proposed for the USMCA relative to NAFTA was packing it full of new giveaways to big pharma that would have jacked up the cost of medicine prices, and packing it full of giveaways to big tech that undermine online privacy, data security, AI accountability. Democrats, others on the left, including many of you, managed to get the pharma giveaways removed, which was great. And of course, it helped that Democrats were in control of the House at the time. But the big tech giveaways were something that made it into the final NAFTA rewrite, and were also something that the Trump administration pushed in other venues, including the WTO. And so looking ahead to the mandated USMCA or NAFTA review that begins in 2025, what changes is the Trump administration going to offer? I'm sure he's going to make them sound great, but the actual substance is something that we're going to have to not only watch very closely, but that we're going to have to hold his feet to the fire on if we want to either get the fixes for workers, family farmers, consumers, the environment that we need, or if we want to see the end to NAFTA that was promised 8 years ago. So the USMCA NAFTA review is something that we're going to hold numerous briefings about over the course of the next year. It is something that will likely take the entire year and into 2026. But if we're going to need to set the tone early on that if we're going to have a major influence over it. And before we even get to that, though, big picture, as we head into another administration headed by someone who, if we're being honest, has shown himself to be a con man on trade, we're going to have to do two things very forcefully and very intentionally. First, we're going to need to look past all the smoke and mirrors and call out false solutions when they're offered. And second, we're going to need to make sure that we and our allies are advocating for just and sustainable trade alternatives rather than falling into the trap of supporting outdated neoliberal ideas and talking points just because they're framed as anti-Trump. So in a minute, Lori is going to talk about how to do that in the context of what will likely be the first major trade action in the incoming administration, namely some sort of action on tariffs. How do we call out false solutions and get people to support just and sustainable alternatives rather than endorsing business as usual policies in some sort of knee-jerk opposition to Trump? That is the key framing on the question of tariffs, and really that's the key framing on all questions of trade during the second Trump administration. Before I hand it over to Lori, though, I want to quickly review four major concepts on how to recalibrate our trade BS detectors as we head into the coming period. Some of you have heard me talk about this before, but it is really important. What do we need to do to make sure that we, our organizations, our communities don't get conned on trade? So first, we need to watch out for bogus claims that obscure who's really responsible for harmful trade policies. Examples of this include comments like the United States is losing to other countries in trade negotiations, or other countries got the better of the United States in past trade deals. We know this idea that other countries are getting the better of the United States in trade negotiations isn't really how things go down. It isn't the main problem we're facing. The truth is that the US government sets the terms of US trade deals, utilizing a process that gives corporate lobbyists privileged access to trade negotiators and to draft texts, while excluding us and excluding almost everybody else. To date, trade deals have worked largely as they were intended to work. They benefit transnational corporations and other elites with little regard to the harm that they cause to working people and to the planet, both at home and abroad. And the concept of one country getting the better of another ignores the fact that corporate-driven trade agreements have been disastrous for working people across borders, and it hides who's truly responsible for these deals. US-based corporations, not foreign governments. So that's the first point. Second, we need to be wary of slogans that falsely conflate nationality with shared economic interests. So what do I mean by that? We've all heard comments like it's time to start putting America first in our trade policy. And if you're American, that doesn't necessarily sound all that unreasonable. But that slogan, America First, is extremely misleading. Within it, there's the implication that the US government is somehow putting foreign interests ahead of those of the United States in trade deals, which is completely untrue. Again, trade deals put the interests of big corporations ahead of the interests of working people in the United States and in every other country. It's not foreigners who are benefiting, it's corporations. And so this concept of America First promotes xenophobia, which is bad enough in and of itself, but it also lumps the interests of different Americans together with one another in a really disingenuous way. It falsely implies that the interests of American businesses, CEOs, Wall Street, are somehow the same as the interests of working Americans, which anyone who has ever had a job knows is often BS. So this improper clumping together of so-called American interests is what enables billionaires, literal billionaires, and other corporate elites to continue dominating trade policymaking rather than prioritizing cross-border worker interests like labor rights, wage increases, job creation, a healthy environment. Third piece of advice, we need to be skeptical of empty critiques of human rights abuses abroad. The unjust actions of foreign governments absolutely deserve to be criticized, but it should be criticized in a way that supports people fighting those abuses on the front lines rather than smearing entire nationalities. So, for example, calling out labor rights abuses by the Chinese government without actually supporting labor rights does nothing to solve the problem. And when it's not grounded in cross-border solidarity, those criticisms risk fanning increased racial hatred, violence against Chinese Americans, other Asian Americans. And that type of rhetoric also, again, serves as camouflage for more of the same policies that privilege U.S. corporate interests at the expense of working people, such as with Trump's 2020 U.S.-China trade deal. Again, that deal said nothing about labor rights or other human rights abuses, and instead included investor and intellectual property provisions designed to help U.S. corporations that move jobs to China to take advantage of those abuses. That's not real change. That's more of the same. And finally, number 4, we need to challenge false dichotomies and artificial limits within trade policy debates. Specifically, this idea that you're either for America first, corporate-driven nationalism, or you're for business as usual, corporate-driven free trade neoliberalism. That's a false dichotomy that we need to blow up. Trumpism versus business as usual are the limits of the trade debate that we're going to see on CNN, MSNBC, Fox News, a lot of other venues. And we need to promote alternative visions based on the understanding that working people around the world often have similar interests, and that policies that are designed to uplift labor rights, environmental standards, other human rights and public interest standards across borders, that's what's needed for ending the global race to the bottom in jobs, wages, and working conditions. It's not Trump's way or the old way. We have other options. We need to push them out there into the public debate, often from the bottom up, because we know the corporate media isn't going to do it for us. So anyhow, like those are some of the big picture reminders we all need to keep in mind as we head into this next period. But let's get specific. Let's talk now about tariffs. And for that, I'm going to turn things over to one of the world's leading experts on fair trade policy, Lori Wallach. Lori, as many of you know, is a founding board member of the Citizens Trade Campaign, and she is the founder and current director of Rethink Trade at the American Economic Liberties Project. She has been a champion of fair trade policy for many decades, and I'm extremely grateful for her insights. Lori, thank you for being here. Please tell us what we need to know about tariffs and anything else in your mind.
Thank you, Arthur, and thank you, Hillary, for organizing this. And thank you for including me. Arthur and Hillary are doing an amazing job, and I really appreciate looking at the names of folks who are attending today, that there are some of the longest standing, most really stalwart advocates for trade justice in the United States here today. So wonderful to be with old friends, and welcome to new friends as well. The theme of today is sort of what's going to happen on trade in the Trump administration. And sorry to disappoint, but I think it's premature to know precisely. And I'm going to explain why that is and what we can know based on the appointments that we have seen. That's number 1. Number 2 is about tariffs. Basically, number 2 is things we know that we're going to be dealing with, regardless of who gets what position, et cetera. And so one of those things is tariffs. And I want to speak a little bit about how to talk about them, how people think about them, et cetera. Then number 3 is just a little bit of a preview of coming attractions. This, again, is things we know are going to be coming up. The U.S. Mexico-Canada Agreement and what's going to happen with the review and renegotiation. Something that we understand the Republicans are likely to bring up, which is PNTR for China, Permanent Normal Trade Relations. And then I want to just touch on de minimis, the trade loophole, which actually in its current form already, but if there are even more tariffs imposed, is going to become the workaround for any kind of trade enforcement actions using tariffs. So and then I want to make sure there's time for Q&A. So just to start with on item number 1, it is too early to know for sure, to the extent you can ever know for sure with Trump, where things are likely to go in trade. And that is because the appointments are still happening. There are really sort of four main super top appointments that are relevant. I mean, five really. One of them is the U.S. Trade Representative, not yet selected. One is the Commerce Secretary, selected, and it's a guy I'm going to explain doesn't really know a whole hell of a lot about trade, and doesn't actually necessarily support any of the things that we support on trade. Then there is the Treasury Secretary, not named yet, highly contested. And then there is the Director of the National Economic Council and the Director of the National Security Council. Both of those are also NEC unnamed, and those are going to be very important. So the thing we do know is the Commerce Secretary guy. And that announcement came with a sort of 2-for-1 deal that Trump offered this guy who is, brace yourself, a Wall Street hedge fund CEO billionaire who, on top of not really being the kind of guy who's likely to know a whole lot of trade justice, also doesn't know trade really at all. So when naming this guy, the announcement that came out of the White House was that he will also have direct supervision over the Office of the U.S. Trade Representative, which is a fairly shocking thing. Now, on the one hand, the statement says he will be running trade and tariffs for the Trump administration. So on the one hand, it's really important to know who this guy is. I'm going to explain why that is a very bad sign for the working class voters, many of whom were decisive in sending Trump back to the White House, and bad for the country. But also, just so everyone remembers, during Trump 1, a similar announcement was done about the Commerce Secretary is going to renegotiate NAFTA, and the Commerce Secretary is going to run USTR, and blah, blah, blah. And that is not what happened. And there are two reasons, just before we get ourselves so twisted around the axle on this. One is there's a statutory requirement under the Trade Act of 1974 that there is a thing called the U.S. Trade Representative, who is a cabinet level person who reports to the president, not the Department of Commerce. And the only way that that gets changed is by changing the statute. So as happened in 2016, you can imagine some of the people in Congress are basically saying, no, that's not happening. But also practically, in Washington, there's like a betting pool opening up about how many weeks or months this guy who was appointed, whose name is Howard Lutnick, is going to actually be the Commerce Secretary with or without supervisory control of the Trade Representative's office. And that gets a little bit to some things to know about him, which is while Trump was telling rallying crowds that he was going to do across the board tariffs, and his theory of the case is you do that both to generate revenue as a means to bring down or end income tax payments, just footnote, economically, that doesn't work. The money doesn't work, but even assuming that that revenue side is the way to think about it, the second part is to try and bring back manufacturing. And you have across the board tariffs, you put them at a relatively noticeable rate, 20%, 10%, and you leave them in place. And that's a theory of basically, if you look at it more from our perspective, that would be from why you'd use tariffs that way. It would be more of a Keynesian rebalancing strategy. So historically, at the end of World War II, when the Bretton Woods institutions were being set up and people like the economist Keynes were involved, the idea was that you would basically, more important than liberalizing trade was to manage balanced trade. And so an instrument like that would be a trade balancing mechanism, ostensibly. So the president's running around, the president-elect Trump is running around saying that. Howard Lutnick is on cable and is on podcasts saying the only useful thing to do with a tariff is as bait, to use as leverage, a bargaining chip, and then you negotiate duty-free access after threatening this. Now, number one, the guy can't be a total ding-dong. He is the CEO of a major Wall Street investment bank, because it's like generally not great if you're the chief negotiator for the US that you tell in advance the people you're going to negotiate with that one of the tactics is you're going to do this thing that's supposed to scare them, but not really. So just starting with that. But separate from that, it's a very different philosophy of trade. So duty-free agreements, that would be like NAFTA, TPP, things the public, and for that matter, Trump hate. That duty-free trade is not what works when you're dealing with countries that, and the big question now is, what do you do with countries that you just know are not going to follow that set of sort of old WTO corporate rules, and they're going to do subsidies, and they're going to manipulate the currencies to get an advantage, and they're going to trash the environment, dump on the environment to get a trade advantage, crush workers' rights, and artificially suppress wages. The question is not about tariffs anymore. It's what, in the sense of duty-free trade, it's what you do to actually, do you trade? How do you trade with countries under that circumstance? So it's like a very backwards, old, outdated, and very corporate neoliberal way of thinking about it. But it also totally conflicts with what the guy who's just hired him is saying is the point. Now, it could be that he really just doesn't know a lot about the topic, which may be true, because if you want to listen to any of these things he's done, and I put links into some of it in tweets I've done recently, he also like says things that are just show a level of ignorance that's appalling. It's not like he doesn't have the sophisticated analysis to know what the right fix is. It's like the guy says publicly, when US exports cars, we face 100% tariffs in Europe and Japan. This is just objectively, factually wrong. And or that when they send cars here, there's a zero duty-free tariff. That's also objectively wrong. He somehow believes this is still in place as something imposed by the Marshall Plan, which actually, just for historical buffs, actually made Europe drop tariffs, not give them 100% tariffs. The whole thing is crazy. And obviously the Marshall Plan is not setting US tariff policy or anyone else's right now. The Marshall Plan is no longer in effect. And in fact, in 1947, the GATT set the tariff rates. So it may be that the guy who's been nominated theoretically to be the Commerce Secretary and supervise USTR like is confusing GATT and gout or something. It's a little worrisome. But also, he doesn't know enough to realize that he's a big advocate of, yes, let's get rid of the income tax so that we can actually have tariffs instead. But obviously, if you're only using temporary tariffs, then you can't get revenue to get rid of the income tax. So to put it mildly, the guy is not a trade expert. And that actually, to the extent that any good things were done during the Trump 1 administration with respect to trade, and I would say there were some real improvements with the USMCA relative to NAFTA, not enough, not the model, didn't make a difference. The trade deficit has gone up. The offshoring has continued. So USMCA on the measures Trump himself put out is a failure as a renegotiation, but some really important things happened. This is like a guy who wouldn't even have any idea of those kind of things and wouldn't be inclined to talk to unions or anyone else about the things that might make a difference if they were, done in a way that actually would change the outcomes. So that scenario does not send a great signal if this is the kind of person that, basically Trump wants to appoint, who both is not on the same philosophy and doesn't know his ear from his elbow on the issues. So that is a bad sign, but we will see with the Treasury appointment. That is probably not going to be someone friendly. Apparently, several other Wall Street guys, this could be like the billionaire cabinet. And there is a lot of confusion about what's going to happen with USTR and NEC. So that's number one. Obviously, personnel is policy. Having Bob Lighthizer as the USTR during the first Trump administration is the only reason anything good happened, because he actually had some of the right instincts that we share on things that ought to get changed, but also he had vast knowledge and technical skills and political capacity to actually deliver it. So I would say preview of coming attractions, this is not looking so great, but more appointments, we'll know more. Now, some things we do know are going to happen, even if it is a total dumpster fire, is we're likely to see some more action on tariffs. And even if we don't see more action, we have the existing tariffs that are in place, which include those that Trump put in place in his first presidency. And then the Biden administration kept most of those. And then in addition, the Biden administration put in place new tariffs. So brand new tariffs on 4 Asian countries, particular companies with respect to solar imports. that were circumventing trade cheating penalties, higher tariffs on some of the same things where the Trump administration had tariffs with respect to microchips, EVs, EV batteries, medical supplies, things that we learned during the COVID crisis that, having totally decimated our capacity to make, made us very vulnerable. And so in areas where we want to rebuild our resilience, the tariff is a good defense, but is not going to be sufficient to get the outcomes we want, which is one of 4 points I want to make about tariffs. So number one is we need to know how to talk about them in a way that is accurate and that is not, I would say, shaped by our natural revulsion about a Trump presidency, but rather is based on how tariffs work, what the facts of the case are. So I would argue that part of how Trump is president again has to do with the Democrats at the presidential level forgetting the lesson of 2016 and walking, actually diving, running into Trump's tariff trap again, which is that the research shows that for many people across the country who are in what are sometimes categorized as factory towns, it's a characterization sort of in the demographics. These are towns that are neither urban, they're sort of middle-sized, Green Bay, Wisconsin, in my home state. They had a long history of manufacturing. They are not rural farm places. They are towns that have gotten really clobbered, where they had basically middle-class jobs for the 2/3 of Americans who don't have college degrees in the working age, who basically also those production facilities helped contribute to tax bases that had strong schools, hospitals, etc. And this is the very shattered, pain communities across the country when particularly China PNTR, permanent normal trade relations, China joining the WTR, resulted in a shock of 5 million net manufacturing jobs gone. So we went from 19 million to 14 million in not that much time. And it was devastating. So in those places that are the hardest hit from NAFTA, that are the hardest hit from China PNTR, the research, which is quite compelling, and it's actually some of the best of it's been done by the team that did the original China shock economic analysis. These are people who are free trade people. They took the data on voting demographics and they crossed it over with where the hardest hit districts, precincts, so within a congressional district were. And what they found is that the word tariff has now become basically like approximate emotive symbolic value of just standing up for me and my community on trade, fighting for me on trade. And in fact, there is a swing you can see between 2016 and 2020 in those districts where actually there's more Republican voting, congressional, presidential, et cetera, in those districts because of the tariff arguments. And it's even more so in 2024. So that there is a way in which, because unfortunately, candidate Harris ran around with a slightly veiled attack on Trump's tariffs, whatever you think about the merits of them politically, and then bringing it up right in the beginning of the debate. So Trump had the opportunity to basically reveal to the whole country, highest political audience viewership, yeah, she's talking about my tariffs when she says national sales tax will raise prices. By the end of this election, 56% of Americans across the board, not just the working class folks who the Democrats lost, which they did. They lost people without college degrees, and they lost people making less than $100,000, a total flip from where Biden had been. Those folks for sure were buying that argument as tariffs symbolically being, I'm going to fight for you. But by the end of the election, Reuters found 56% of all Americans supported the idea of across-the-board tariffs. So the ads, the Harris administration, campaign was putting up to become the next administration attacking tariffs, having their surrogates like billionaire Mark Cuban running around attacking tariffs, very counterproductive. So once again, a whole block of people in key swing states who are working people saw there was no message from Democrats that was for them. you know, as we all know, there are 19 million votes that Biden got that Harris didn't. And so it's as much the staying home. It's like, you know, it's the couch versus Trump, and the couch won over Trump, but you know, the couch also beat Harris. So the result of that is basically the Democrats are seen as the anti-tariff, weak on trade, symbolic. Just think about the symbolism versus Trump is like, Mr. I'll stand up for you in trade. He just appointed someone who's not going to deliver and wouldn't know how to if you were inclined, but also philosophically does not agree. But we have, in a certain way, a responsibility to help educate our colleagues and friends of the organizations we're in about how to talk about tariffs. So let's talk Turkey, okay? Number one, tariffs do not always increase consumer prices. That is not accurate. And those studies that Vice President Harris ran with as her big campaign slogan are totally cooked. So here's the reality everyone needs to understand. And on our website at rethinktrade.org, it's a very helpful fact sheet with footnotes that unpacks all of this. But tariffs are applied at the wholesale value. They're not applied at the retail value. They're applied at the wholesale value. So the tariff is supposed to send a signal to people who buy wholesale, retail stores, and people who buy parts for manufacturing. That is, don't buy it here. There's something wrong going here. They've been hit by a tariff. They're forced labor people. They are subsidizing unfairly, whatever it is. Don't buy it here. Buy it here. And here could be a country that's playing by the rules. So it's a non-tariffed import, or it's domestic. But either way, the idea is to send a price signal at the wholesale level. Don't buy it here. Now, whether that price increase gets passed on to consumers is totally relies totally on several factors. One, are there domestic or other non-tariff countries where the stuff is made? Interestingly, with the China tariffs, U.S. Tara Lighthizer did a selection system that basically found things that wasn't the case and left those off the list. Number two, is there a large markup margin? So just to make this very practical, a tariff, let's just say of 20% gets put on the Nikes that we pay $100 for. 20% tariff is on the landed price, the wholesale price plus like shipping. So let's just say, because I've looked this one up, that's typically $15 or less. So we're huge markup. We're paying $100 for this. Comes in at $15. 20% tariff is $3. So the $3 on top of the $15, $18 of total cost, the markup to get to 100 is still so big. And they've charged 100 because they know that's what we'll pay. That has nothing to do with some theory of how much it costs and the marketing and distribution. That's just like, they know that's the price point. Okay, so they'll eat some of the markup. And a key finding, studies in footnotes and all in that fact sheet I mentioned, is that during the China tariffs, a lot of the tariff price was absorbed in reduced profits. A lot of the tariff price was absorbed in reduced profits. And I just want to puncture one particular example you see all over so you guys all know how to counter it. The infamous washing machine example. They talk about Trump tariffs on washing machines, increasing washing machine prices. And here's what everyone should know. One of the other factors in what happens with prices is because there's such horrible concentration, monopolization in many production sectors of production in too few countries and too few companies, that actually something like a tariff can be it's an excuse to raise prices. So here's the most important thing to find in the key study written by a bunch of free trade professors that showed actually that China tariffs did not cause major consumer price increases. They looked into the washing machines, and what they found is prices also went up in Canada, where there were no new tariffs. Rather, it was a handful of companies that under all those different brands you might be buying, there are only 3 or 4 manufacturers, used as an excuse, not just here, but other places. It's not actually a guarantee. And the place finally is a factor where it doesn't get passed through is where there's price competition. And so even if something has a small markup, if a company wants to keep its share of the market, it may actually take a bigger hit, not just like Nike's small dip in its ridiculous markup, but a bigger hit to make sure it holds its market share. So very important point, tariffs do not always increase prices. So all those studies are $4,000 more tax on every American family for everything gets tariff, blah, blah, blah. That is just sloppy math where they basically did like, oh, what's the import value times 20%, add that, there's a number, divide by households. That's actually not how it works. So that's a key thing everyone should know. Number two, what does a tariff do? It's a defense. Like when people say, I'm for strong trade enforcement, you can either have an embargo where you just keep the stuff out, or you can have a tariff. Tariffs do the following things. They either try and force a change in behavior, stop cheating, follow the rules, then you can come back in, we take away the tariff. They put that particular producer out of the market, which is to say, okay, we're going to buy from these other places if a tariff is on you, and you can either sell someplace else, or you can go to business, or you can change your behavior. Number three, they countervail the price so that a good that is made under unfair conditions, be it environmental, labor, subsidies, does not knock out the domestic demand and market for production that is made, say, here or in a trade partner country where there are labor standards, there are environmental rules, etc. You don't want the cheating stuff to basically, because it's cheaper from cheating, knock out the stuff that actually is the cost to do it right. And so as a defense, tariffs are very important. That's sometimes called countervailing, so that you actually have the tariff as a defense, which then gets to point three. And this is very important. Tariffs alone will not rebuild our manufacturing, make anyone feel they have a better, resilient supply chain, improve our national security, because we saw practically, and this is the one slide I'm going to show folks because it's so shocking, you won't believe it, but we had very significant tariffs imposed by Trump 1, yet investment in U.S. manufacturing construction, factory construction, new factories, was pretty much flat, despite those big tariffs, until 2021, when we see the Infrastructure Act get passed, when we see then the CHIPS bill in 2022, when we see the Inflation Reduction Act. And so I'm going to just very quickly pop on the screen share so everyone can see what the slide looks like of this chart, because it is a really stunning, hopefully people can see that. It is a really stunning, like ski slope type jump, where you can basically see, here are the bills, the green lines are those industrial policy bills. What are those? So tariffs work when they're combined with tax policies that both create domestic consumption and demand. So, you know, the tax credit for buying an EV that is made in the US and has battery made in the US, the tax credit for solar, but also tax credits for new manufacturing to help with the construction, etc. It is also investment. There are grants out there for instance, some of the chip manufacturers. There are low interest loans. As well, procurement policy. Is the government going to create demand by actually procuring the stuff? These are all tools of industrial policy, and tariffs obviously are a really important one of those. But look what happened. We basically broke through the record that was set in 2015 for factory investment growth after the 2022 passage of the IRA and the passage of the CHIPS bill. And in 2023, we hit the highest rate of manufacturing investment constructing new factories in the United States of America in 30 years. In 30 years. Like my graph doesn't go back that far, but in 30 years. That is actually a very big deal. Other things that very sadly we didn't hear the Harris campaign talk about is thanks to that, even before most of those jobs are coming online, we had 150,000 more manufacturing jobs based on the beginning of it, of the boom, at the end of 2023, and there's more since, than the Trump administration had pre-COVID at any time during his first term. So there is a lesson of tariffs. They're an important tool. They need to be used the right way. They do not always increase costs for consumers. They have been demonized. Basically, economists feel about tariffs like Dracula feels about holy water, but that is sort of a faith-based relationship with tariffs. There are good uses for them. And when all of us talk about we want to enforce labor standards, that USMCA rapid response mechanism, in the end, what happens is first you get nailed with tariffs and then you get your market cut off if you don't follow the rules. So if you're for trade enforcement, tariffs are one of those tools. Now, I just want to flag that as a candidate, Trump said this time around, he's going to kill that industrial policy funding. So another thing for all of us to watch is, are we actually going to see Trump, despite totally attacking the IRA, all of these industrial policies, if he keeps it, and probably even if he doesn't, he's going to get a bunch of those jobs because there's a lag. If I showed you the tariffs, if I showed you the increased tariffs and industrial policy stuff of Biden, but then I showed you manufacturing jobs, it's a 2-year lag. It's a 3-year lag. You have to build the factories. So Trump may get some of that and announce, look at my big boom. That's the industrial policies of Biden kicking in. But maybe he'll basically kill the goose that could lay the golden eggs by cutting off the funding as he's promised. Okay, I'm going to largely stop there and just hit 3 other points in very high level overviews. 1, extra point, USMCA. Just to flag for folks, Arthur was spot on. That process is a 6-year review by the 1st of July in 2026. The 3 countries have to decide to continue the USMCA as is for another term, which is 16 years. It has a 16-year term. It's novel. It has a sunset. It doesn't last forever like most trade agreements. Or they cannot come to a deal about what they're going to do going forward, and then it goes into a 1-year review cycle. Or they can renegotiate it and then agree to have it go 16 years, 6 years, whatever. So what we need is a renegotiation. There's some very good ideas in there that were steps in the right direction, but some of the stuff is not working out the way we'd hope. And one of the biggest indicators, I think, of that is that our brothers and sisters in the labor movement, the independent labor movement in Mexico, though there has been great use of the rapid response mechanism, it's still not the systematic, basically symbolic sword of Damocles that is changing behavior market-wide. It is still case by case. People who've benefited from it in workplaces in Mexico have gotten higher wages, et cetera. But that needs to be tightened up. There are other things in there that still need significant fixing. And I see some of our friends from the food and agriculture, family, farm world, like we need to get basically mandatory country of origin labeling back in that renegotiation, et cetera. So the USMCA process by statute starts this year. The end date is 2026. So it's this year that this is going to happen, just to underscore what Arthur said. Next thing is PNTR for China, Permanent Normal Trade Relations. That is the infamous vote of 2000, where Congress got rid of what were annual reviews about whether China would get what's called, is really called most favored nation treatment. Basically, it's the tariffs we give to the countries that we consider our trade partners under WTO, under GATT, that we consider all sort of as following the same rules. There is quite a push. It's actually starting with the Republicans. It's starting in the House, but it also has support from two big bipartisan sort of centers of China trade policy thinking. There's a China Special Standing Committee in the House. It's bipartisan. They have issued a recommendation to terminate permanent normal status for trade status for China. And then there's a thing called the U.S. China Economic and Security Review, which for the 2nd year in a row has recommended the same. It is commissioners appointed by the leaders of the Democratic and Republican Party, House and Senate leadership. So that would be a very interesting debate. What that would literally mean is tariffs for China would go into a different column of our tariff schedule and be much higher. Then the 5th item in the whole list is de minimis. I just want to flag, I know a lot of people have heard a lot about de minimis, which is the name of the loophole that today allows more than 4 million packages, largely purchased online, mainly from China, to come in skirting all tariffs, taxes, and inspection. Many of the interests that have really exploited that, Shein, Temu, but for instance, this new Amazon direct bucket thing that they're doing, all of those guys plan to even do more, as do other retailers, use of de minimis if there are across the board tariffs from President Trump. And the fact of that is, in there is also skirting things like the ban on forced Uyghur labor. In there is skipping the ban on endangered species goods. In there is sneaking in all kinds of dangerous products, from like stuff the Consumer Product Safety Commission says is unsafe for kids, to fake medicines, etc. And so this is an enormous problem. Whatever you think about Trump's tariffs, the fact is any kind of trade enforcement is getting gutted by this loophole. And so the question is, what's going to happen with it? So far, the Republicans in Congress have been blocking any kind of major fix. There are a lot of very powerful lobbies, the express delivery guys like FedEx and DHL, the big companies that want to bring in this stuff online, duty-free, and basically cheat your local stores. They are pushing and pushing. It's a fight we're going to have to deal with. So the final word I just want to close with is the difference between targeted strategic tariffs and across the board tariffs. So if it weren't obvious by what I had said about the prices, obviously the across the board tariffs are more likely to raise prices. The targeted tariffs, where there's the option of buying from a different country that may be following the rules, they're less likely to raise prices. Both of them have different uses. The way I describe tariffs, where you basically use it as one tool among many for a targeted industrial policy, is the approach that Democrats have typically started to adopt since they started thinking about actually having an industrial policy again. And in a variety of these sectors, we've seen the big boom in construction. We're going to have to track what happens with these new factories, what happens with employment, et cetera. And of course, I will be doing that, and I'll be thrilled to meet with everyone again with that information. Then the across the board tariffs are more of like a macroeconomic approach. And there isn't really an example of the theory of what they want to do. The last time there were across the board tariffs like this was Nixon. It was during the period where we came off the gold standard. A bunch of countries, mainly in Europe, were basically devaluing their currencies, and we were in a huge inflationary spiral, and we had a huge trade deficit. And the so-called Nixon shock, one of the tools they used was 10% across the board tariffs that were put in place for 4 months. It was basically like used by a 2x4 upside the head. So Germany, Italy, some other countries basically raised the value of their currencies to stop having that as an advantage. And we went off the gold standard. Currencies used to be convertible to a value of gold, et cetera. But there's not been the example of using the tariff as a sort of macroeconomic balance correction. And for folks who want to understand more of what's behind that theory, a guy I would recommend you read is a guy named Michael Pettis, who is the rare economist who's very focused on trade balance. And a lot of the thinking behind this is Pettis thinking, probably through our friend, former USTR Lighthizer. And with that, I'm going to stop and turn it back to Arthur. Or Hillary.
I think we're going to jump in for some Q&A for Arthur and Lori, and we have a ton of questions. So we're going to try to get to as many of these as we can in the 10 minutes that we have remaining on our call. The first one, and this is one, the spirit behind this question I hear a lot. So I'm eager to hear, Arthur, Lori, if you have any helpful intel for us. Earlier this year, Biden increased tariffs on some specific industries, I think specific goods even. And there were a lot of groups out there praising those tariffs. Can you talk a little bit more specifically about the difference between those tariffs that everyone was praising and the kinds of tariffs that Trump is proposing right now?
So the tariffs that everyone was praising were basically targeted much higher than Trump, though on the same categories, though some new ones too. Those were the tariffs I mentioned on EVs, EV batteries at 100%, increasing from 25% to 50%, the tariffs on certain microchips, and then getting rid of a waiver of tariffs on Section 301 tariffs on